to ask you, do you think that we should focus on family dynamics to help generational violence?
That's all you have. It is family dynamics.
Mm-hmm.
It's the understanding. I mean, and the tragedy for so many people is that as a child, but particularly in dysfunctional families, nobody speaks. So the children very often have no idea what happened to their parents. They just see them behaving in these very dysfunctional and violent ways and abusive ways. It isn't often till they're much, much older that they look back and somehow information is given to them. And I didn't know till about 8 years ago, a cousin from Seattle, I had no idea who she was, actually sent me information about my mother. I knew my mother was a pathological liar, but I'd never realized the extent. And one of the tragedies, when her mum died in childbirth with her sister, who was younger, and then my grandfather, who was violent and alcoholic, actually married an extremely violent stepmother who hated his natural children. And that's where my mother's damaged. Not only was she lost her mother at a very young age, but she also had this horrific woman. And as for my father, it was an appalling background. And that comes with understanding. And there's not enough known about these families. All we do now, here as well as in England, we dump them in great big ghettos. We have huge ghettos. And every so often in England, because England's got a very clever move, which they essentially bribe people from these families. There's enough, they get their rent paid, they get their council tax paid, and they get enough money to just manage to live so they don't revolt. Other countries you see big revolutions, but ours are really opiated. And everybody hates me to say that, but it's the truth. And every so often, like last year, you suddenly saw a riot, and then there's a slight nervous feeling, and then it all goes back to sleep again. But what we call the underclass is getting bigger and bigger. And now there's situations where we have, I don't know that you have them here, but if a woman is a single parent mother or she's pregnant at 16, she gets her own apartment and she gets enough money to survive. But what's happened is that you have a huge amount of men who can't and don't know how to make relationships because they've come from these families. The same for the women. So you can't even call the fathering of these children a relationship because they can't father or mother. All you can see is that she will be having 4, 5, 6, 7 children. And we have estates of hundreds and literally thousands of houses where there are no men. There are mothers on their own with their children. And it's a recipe for disaster.
How are all these mothers getting kids without the father around?
Different fathers. Many of the women I work with, they have 4 children, probably 3 fathers. They get into these, they're not relationships because they can't make relationships. Relationships essentially are 2 people making some sort of communication and a lifestyle with each other. But if you have no idea, because a number of them have also been in care as children, because as the mother breaks down because she's not coping, the children are taken away, they're moved on to foster parents. I mean, it's very, very abusive. And it happens here as well. Your child's care systems in most of the Western world are atrocious.
Mm-hmm.
In a sense, you could almost say the Western world has now become a place where any child that isn't protected by a mother and father is going to be abused, if not by the parents, but certainly by the system.
So we can all agree that having a father in the picture, and a mother obviously, are...
Yes, I mean, my idea is, I've been divorced twice, so I'm not talking from any kind of, essentially, the goalpost, essentially, for me, is if you have one roof, a mother and a father and the children, the biological mother and father, that is probably the best you can do. If it breaks down, as it did in my case, well, then what you can do is there are other forms of family now. It isn't whether it's a mother or a father, it's the lovingness that matters. And I think we're now getting sophisticated enough to understand that. Children don't need, it doesn't have to be a mother and a father. It can be a father and a father or a mother and a mother. It doesn't matter. It's the quality of loving. But it is important, right the way through, that the biological side of a child, 50% of the genes belong to the father and 50% to the mother. If the father leaves, he still has a responsibility to validate his children, and I think the same for the mother. Because you leave, it doesn't have to be a tragedy. You don't have to leave your children. And as a mother, and it's mostly unfortunately mothers, who will act against fathers and try, once they've finished with the relationship, they move on, and they don't want the father in the children's life. And that's very dangerous. And the most dangerous thing of all, and terrible child abuse, is where one or both parents alienate the child from the parent, the other parent. And that has to be stopped, because it does such damage, because those children become, if it's the mother's version of the wicked, dreadful father, the child's brain gets hardwired with this information, and they actually don't know that other parent. The only version they've got is through their mother's eyes. So often they will actually become extremely hostile to the other parent, never knowing that it's a good, warm, loving man who wants his children. And I feel and the same goes the other way. We need to concentrate on the realities of what makes children happy, harmonious, and good citizens. At the moment, we really don't bother.
Why do you think we don't bother?
There's no money in it. I mean, if you think, from my time, when actually being married was a profession, raising children was idealized in many ways, but the needs for children was actually a priority for both the mother and the father. Now in England, in fact, the new law that's coming in is that couples who are working will be given, I think it's something like over £1,000 a year extra for the two as working mothers towards credit for childcare. If a woman's home with children, she gets nothing. Wow. It's changing now. Women used to have a choice. I had a choice. I could work or I could not work. They don't have a choice now. Women are being pushed out to work. If a woman is single on her own now in England, by the time the child's 5, she's expected to work. And the children would go into childcare. But there's nobody home. And that is not a future for the children of any of our countries. It doesn't matter if the mother does the mothering or the father's home and does the fathering. It doesn't matter. But somebody has to be there.
So you're fairly traditionalist in that sense. That
I think the tradition is thousands of years old. I think it's what works. And young, very, very fragile children, at least until they're old enough probably to go to 11 years old when they start going to their secondary schools. There needs to be somebody at home for them. Actually, I think for family life, it's become impossible because women are so exhausted. That's what I see. If it was true that the majority of men come home and throw themselves into the housework and the cooking and everything else, it isn't true and it never will be true. I don't think. I know because wherever I travel, I always ask women in the audience. And yes, some women will say, yes, my husband's 50-50, but most of them aren't. And I don't think it's going to change. There was a great hope, I remember the feminists saying, we are going to make men more like women. Well, I at the time was trying not to laugh, and I was thinking to myself, good luck to you. There's some things that aren't going to change.
I mean, I could see how feminists are angry that men don't hold up their half of the bargain and help out around the house. I also agree that it's pretty far-fetched to expect them to when, I mean, my boyfriend still doesn't know how to use a laundry machine and
if he did, you wouldn't want what he did to the laundry. That's my argument. I mean, so many women will say, yes, he does try, but then I have to do it all again. Because in a way, I mean, it's probably hardwired. Men simply don't see what we see. Feminized men do. Gay guys do. They run beautiful homes.
Yeah.
But the old heterosexual male. And what do you want at the end of the day? What sort of relationship do you want? You know.
Well, Warren Farrell, his big talking point is women got choices from the feminist movement. They could stay home, work full-time, or work part-time while...
Well, we were ridiculed if we said we wanted to stay home by the moment. They screamed at us, because my group, we were all at home with small children. We stood up and we said, look, while our children are small, we want to be home, we want to be housewives. We think we're lucky because we've got this time. And they were furious because the idea, any woman who was at home was betraying, apart from being married. And one of the things they used to tell us, that sleeping with a man was sleeping with the enemy. Hang on a moment, still.
Yeah.
Dare? Oh, she's gone. Can you let whoever that is in? Okay, where were we? Sleeping with the enemy.
Oh, well, so women staying home and feminists having a problem with that.
Yeah, always have had. The idea, if you have to remember, the radical feminist idea has always been that men are the enemy, that the new model is women and children, which is largely what has been happening anywhere, if you think about it.
Mm.
And with more and more men, which is what the MRAs now are a voice to actually reckon with. And what they're saying is that to be a man, to make any sort of relationship with a woman is extremely dangerous. Women can now, in a home, pick up the phone and call the police to take the man away. They don't have to have any evidence. They can just say, he's intimidating me, he's hostile, whatever. And they have to be, in some cases, if there's a fight going on, the police are mandated to only take the man out in some areas.
Mm.
So there he not only loses his rights to be innocent till he's proven guilty, he is actually guilty. And then what happens after that is that unless she decides to change her mind, he loses his house, he loses his children, he probably doesn't even get to see them. This is a it's a long, terrible road for men who are in this position. And essentially, in the Western world, in intimate partner relationships, men have lost absolutely everything. And there is no guarantee when they get married or they live with a woman that anything's going to ever be protected. And the most frightening thing is the false allegations. And in Canada, I was interested, when a man comes home from work and his wife and children are gone and their possessions, it's called hoovering. She's hoovered up and she's gone off to a shelter. He won't know where the shelter is and he won't be told. He'll be told by the police that she's safe, and that's all. So suddenly he's faced with that. One of the problems in the shelters, and a lot with the lawyers, your attorneys, is that they will use domestic violence as a fast track to divorce. And they will advise women to claim domestic violence. And if that doesn't work fast enough, it's called the silver bullet in Canada. She claims that he's molested the children, and then that's finished for him for the rest of his life. And that's one of the tragedies of it all, that it has become now completely dishonest and corrupt. And the feminized courts and the feminized judiciary, feminized social services, civil services, right the way through, there is a huge diaspora of men who have lost everything, and it has been unjust, seriously unjust.
Why aren't false accusers being prosecuted?
They're not.
Why aren't they?
Because they're believed. Didn't you know that all women are innocent victims of men's violence? And if a woman says that she's a victim of domestic violence, she can't be questioned. And she isn't questioned. And there is no evidence necessary.
Who made this rule up?
This has been going on for 40 years from the very beginning. And this is all encased in the whole of the shelter movement, or the domestic violence shelter movement. And the shelter movements are secret, you don't know where they are, and they're unaccountable, and there is no research done in them. The research that's put out by the feminist movement is mostly erroneous. The 1 in 4 argument. There is actually no control groups. There is no, that 1 in 4 comes from women in the refuge. Asking women what they didn't ask is how many men have been abused. It's this, essentially, to me it's been fraud for all these years. I think that that particular time when the feminist movement were desperate for funding because they'd run out of publicity, and they were desperate for funding and they needed a just cause. And unfortunately, it fell into their laps. And that's what has really, in a sense, destroyed the whole fabric of our societies, our Western societies. As less and less people will even risk marrying each other. And the myths have grown up to where, essentially, I think, particularly in America on your campuses, I've always said I think they're hostile places for young men. There's an institutionalized hostility. And I was talking to a very, very bright young professor in England the other day. I was staying with his parents, and he said, well, you see, all the women at my university, the Chancellor of the Vice, they're all radical feminist women who've worked their way up into these positions of power. He said, I hang on by my fingertips because I say what they want me to say, or I will go. And it's the same. I've been in conferences here. The first conference in Sacramento, which was the all-inclusive conference, was wonderful, men and women coming together. But people were saying, if my university knew I was here, I would be in serious trouble. That's still the case today. Campuses are largely, over the years, the people who are in power are radical feminists, and they don't think there is any place for men. And so their kangaroo courts is what there are. There are lots and lots of kangaroo courts. So if men are accused by women, they have no representation.
This is frightening, to say the least, because it sounds like there's this huge conspiracy that everyone's oblivious to.
Yes, I think that's right. And it has been going on for a very long time. And there is this feeling of when you talk to normal, ordinary people who aren't involved, they can't. In the early days, I was this terribly lone voice saying these things, and I had an awful time. I'm even in almost every area, because you have to realize that when the radical feminist movement moved into all sorts of areas, it wasn't just the law, it was into the media, into publishing. I did a study of the first 100 women that came into my refuge, and it's very clear that 62 of the women were as violent as the men they left. There was no way I could ever get that published, ever. You just can't, because one of the problems is that as far as the newspapers are concerned, women's issues are covered by women. Well, the majority, not all, but the majority of, for a long time, especially in England, of the women journalists were radical feminists. And as I know that there are lots and lots and lots of women out there who are feminists and would be proud to call themselves feminists, and they're equity feminists, but they are no part of this radicalized, in a sense, very isolated, because the domestic violence movement has become the engine that actually runs the radical and funds them. And that's really the problem. And the problem is that so many men, because of the fact that all men are abusers and perpetrators, it has made a huge war between men and women. It's called the gender war, and it works, and it's in existence. And I look at young women who I think are absolutely wonderful, but I know no man's going to marry them because men are less and less willing to make committed relationships. And what's the future in that?